Welcome everyone to the Toontrack Solo live application settings tutorial. In this particular tutorial, we're going to talk about using Superior Drummer, or this could apply to EZdrummer as well, in a live situation where you are using Toontrack Solo as your host for the plugin. I use Superior Drummer 2.0 for nearly every single one of the gigs that I do. I have an electronic kit that I use, and I'm always using Toontrack Solo. The reason for this is I don't have a need to open up an entire DAW like Cubase or Pro Tools or something that's gonna eat up more processing than I really want to do. I mean, I really want my computer functioning as efficiently as possible, and Toontrack Solo does a really good job to really just have a low CPU and a low processing footprint and allow you to run Superior Drummer standalone. Now, there's some settings we're gonna cover here that I always make sure are set. Kind of my checklist to make sure everything is working. So the specific settings that I always check are as follows. The first thing I do is just make sure I'm getting level. So I'm going to check my mixer meters here, and I will either play my electronic kit, or in this case, I'm going to just click on the drums and just make sure I'm getting level. You can see I have a pretty good level going on, and I'm not clipping. It's very important to keep in mind these LED lights at the very top. If those go red, for example, if I turn this sampler up, I'm going to go way past 0 here. You can see I'm starting to clip. And you want to definitely stay away from that. So if you do clip, first of all, you can click on the LED to turn those off again, and you need to make your adjustments accordingly so that you know that you're not going to do any clipping. And typically I'll turn down the sampler and maybe these levels just a bit rather than having everything at 0. And you can see we can do that. We're getting pretty close to clipping, but everything's probably going to be okay. Now, as soon as I start putting effects and changing levels of things, that's most likely where I'd run into some problems. So typically I will turn things down just a bit. This is going to completely depend on which band I'm playing in as well. I have actually different settings for each band, different presets. And I know exactly, even without pulling up the preset, I know what those levels are. I'm always checking to make sure those levels are correct so that I'm consistently sending the same amount of signal, the same levels to the front of house, so that the person running sound isn't getting a really loud signal one night and a really soft signal the next. I mean, the nice thing about this software is once you get it dialed in, you can make it consistent night after night. So that's the very first thing I check. The next thing I do is I come up to the menu here, the Toontrack Solo menu, and I go into options. Now, before I go into these settings, this may look a little bit different if you have an older version of Toontrack Solo. Make sure you have the latest version if you're wanting to follow this particular tutorial. At the time of this recording, I am using the 1.3.2 version of Toontrack Solo. And so I will go into the options setting. Basically, there's just a whole lineup of settings that I always double check. Typically, if you get your configuration saved right, when you open your configuration file, it really should load these settings. However, I always just take a few minutes and double check these settings every time. We're going to go into options, into the audio menu here, and we're going to check the audio device. Now, right now, I'm not on my live setup. I'm at my home computer. I'm using an AudioBox 22 VSL. That's a USB interface, and that is going to be my audio output. Okay, so that is basically what Superior Drummer and what Toontrack Solo is going to send the audio through, and then you can connect your output cables to that interface, and then that can go straight to the board. In my live setup, I'm actually using a Motu Ultralight. Whatever you're using, you just want to make sure it is, in fact, highlighted. So the next setting is, under the same menu, Options Audio, we're going to look at Audio Output Channels. Okay, now this is going to be dependent on the actual audio device that you have selected. So if you don't have the proper audio device selected, you're not necessarily going to see the proper audio channel. So it's very important that you do go in the order I'm showing you here. On my Motu Ultralight, I will actually have several more channels, and I have to go through and actually checkbox each and every one to enable it. Otherwise, even if I have my audio routed correctly, it's not going to output unless they're checked. So sometimes you might see this. You know, it might be highlighted but unchecked, and you might have more outputs. You want to make sure that those outputs are selected. Now, this is something that's very, very easy to miss. It's the latency settings. This is something you need to be aware of when using electronic drums or any controller when you are triggering in real time. There's always latency. Now, usually you can get it low enough that you really don't perceive it. But if you leave everything at default settings, you're not really taking advantage of some of the options here like you should. And in fact, you're going to be playing with a little bit of latency. Now, you can compensate and you can get used to it, but I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be using the lowest latency settings. In Toontrack Solo, usually it can handle the lowest latency settings. In fact, the computer that I'm using live is a fairly old computer, several years old. It's nothing too robust at all, and it handles it just fine. So I'm going to click into these latency settings, and this is set to 64 right now because that's the lowest setting you can have, and that's what I typically would suggest using. I've seen it usually default to 256. So if you do not do anything, this is the setting it's set to. So basically, you're going to want to have the latency settings set to the lowest setting currently possible in Toontrack Solo, and that is 64. That's going to really just give you the most realistic experience, and especially if you're playing with in-ears and you have a floor monitor, I mean, things are going to be triggering pretty much real time, and it's going to feel very comfortable. The higher you set this, in fact, the more of a delay there's going to be, and at a certain point, you're not going to be able to stand it. You're going to really want that set to as low of a setting as possible. The next setting we're going to look at is MIDI devices. Now, this is going to be dependent once again on the audio interface that you're using. Usually an audio interface like the PreSonus AudioBox 22 VSL or like the Motu Ultralight, it's going to have a MIDI interface as well. It's going to accept MIDI input, and then it's going to be able to communicate that MIDI data to your computer. You just need to make whatever you are using the option that is actually highlighted here. Now, in this case, I'm using the AudioBox 22 VSL. I just need to make sure that is checked. Now, depending on the drum module you're using, some of the newer drum modules like the TD30 have a USB output that you can connect directly to your computer. So you just need to make sure that whatever MIDI interface you are using, it is highlighted and checked. Now, the last option we're going to look at here is the controller setting. It defaults to a setting of default in Toontrack Solo. However, if you're using an electronic drum set as your controller, there are two settings that you need to enable. Otherwise, things are probably not going to work the way you would expect. You need to set this to EZdrums, then you want to go back in and you need to set this CC offset and enable that. Now, the reason these settings are important is because it basically informs Toontrack Solo that you are using an electronic drum set as your controller, as opposed to using a keyboard or just utilizing incoming MIDI. The CC offset setting is also very important because that informs Toontrack Solo that you are using a hi-hat controller that has continuous controller functionality. And what that means is when you open and close the pedal, it's actually keeping track of where the pedal board is. So you have, of course, fully open and fully closed, but you also have incremental steps of open and close in between as well. And all of that MIDI information is getting sent from your controller and your module. However, Toontrack Solo has to know that that is what you are using, as opposed to a pedal that just has open and just has close and nothing in between. So if you do not set CC offset, then your hi-hat pedal is not going to respond as you would expect. So it's very important to set both of these settings. So that is basically it for this tutorial. Again, these are the exact steps and settings I set before every single performance that I do, where I'm using Toontrack Solo as my standalone host for Superior Drummer.